All right, fraud risk management principle number 2 does tie back to our internal control component number 2, the risk assessment. But we are going to be focusing specifically on the risk of fraud. Okay, so it's not just risk assessment in general, but specifically related to the risk of fraud at the organization. Now, I have again uploaded the report to the nations. Included within that report is what is commonly referred to as the fraud tree. And you can go and take a look at it. There are 3 major categories of organizational fraud, and within each one of those categories there are a multitude of potential schemes that could be perpetrated at an organization. And with this fraud risk assessment, the organization is going to be performing a comprehensive fraud risk assessment to identify specific fraud schemes and risk that the organization could be the victim of. And just like with a regular risk assessment, they're going to assess their likelihood and their significance, and also evaluate what fraud control activities currently exist. And again, are they functioning as designed or not? And if necessary, will implement changes and additional controls into place to mitigate residual fraud risk that remain. So what we're getting at here with this fraud risk assessment is that it does need to be comprehensive. So it's not just internal control risk, but specifically those that relate to fraud, and then many kinds that the organization could become a victim of. Now, within that report to the nations, you guys are going to see a lot of data in regards to the types of schemes that an organization could become the victim of. You will also see a list regarding specific industries and the types of schemes that have been seen quite frequently within those industries. Information and knowledge such as this helps us to do a better job of managing our fraud risk. When we evaluate those existing control activities, we are going to be considering, are they working? How could they be circumvented? Again, we've got collusion that could be occurring. We know that managers can override controls. Things like that will be thought about when we're doing a thorough fraud risk assessment. And of course, we're definitely going to make sure that we implement new controls if necessary, or improve our existing ones to help us do a better job. Now, what is the definition of fraud? For the COSO guide, our distinct group of parties there settled on the following definition. So fraud, for the purposes of the fraud risk management guide, is any intentional act or omission designed to deceive others, resulting in the victim suffering a loss and or the perpetrator achieving a gain. I will be sharing with you all another definition of fraud at a later time. But I want you to see that it can be an intentional act, or it can be omission of information or data, And this act or this omission has been designed by the perpetrator to deceive the company or others. And someone, the organization, suffers a loss, or the perpetrator achieves some type of a gain, and the organization may not suffer an actual loss. With our fraud risk assessment, when we do this, we need to involve appropriate levels of management. So we need to be talking really just not only to management, but people within the organization with extensive knowledge of operations. And I'd like to suggest that organizations be open to also getting assistance from an objective, independent, certified fraud examiner or CPA with internal control knowledge and experience. We need to include internal audit. We need to include external audit. Who all knows our organization, knows our policies and procedures, know how our systems work, and how could they be circumvented. We need to include looking at every entity, subsidiary, division, operating unit, and functional level, and include people at these levels. As many times as you should see within that report to the nations, these lower level employees have quite a bit more info and experience in the processes and procedures and the lack thereof, and can give very insightful information in regards to how things are really working. Are the internal controls really functioning like they're supposed to be? Or are there some workarounds going on? Many times doing a fraud risk assessment and getting lots of input from many individuals within an organization can actually be a huge reality check for management. We also need to consider, when we do our fraud risk assessment, analyzing internal factors, but also external factors. What is our environment like? Who are our outside parties that we do business with? Not only our customers, but also our vendors and suppliers and others. What other kinds of things are going on in our industry that could possibly subject us to fraud risk? We need to specifically consider various types of fraud. Again, the fraud tree. What kinds of things could occur at our organization? And again, we're going to be building a toolkit, if you will, for you guys to use later in your jobs when you do risk assessment, period, but also fraud risk assessments. We're going to specifically consider the risk of management overriding our controls. As you guys will see within that report to the nation, in 2018, 11% of the cases involved executive upper management. Overriding of controls is taking place. And with executive upper management, the median loss was $729,000. That can put a small to medium-sized organization into bankruptcy. And if it's privately owned, the owners could also have to file personal bankruptcy. We need to, of course, estimate the likelihood and significance of the risk identified. We all should know that by now. And assess the personnel and the departments involved in all aspects of the fraud triangle. As you guys will see within that report to the nation, there is a list of departments where frauds are perpetrated quite frequently. And we're talking about the accounting department, operations, sales, executive and upper management, customer service, purchasing or procurement, finance, and administrative support personnel. We need to assess their ability to perpetrate a fraud, their ability to circumvent internal controls. We need to consider what all they have access to, what capabilities they have, what opportunities exist, and somehow come up with a plan regarding how we're going to deal with that. Which brings me to my Where's Waldo slide. Several of you have hopefully played Where's Waldo at some point in your life, but basically it was a game. You could either do it on a board game or in a book, and you had to look for Waldo. And as long as you knew what Waldo looked like, you could locate him on a picture that looks something like this. I bring this up because I really want you guys to be more professionally skeptical as you are going to be moving forward in your career. You're not always going to know what Waldo looks like. You need to be able to see what types of things are occurring that need to draw your attention to them, because you need to understand that the perpetrators are not going to be running around with a red flag per se. You're going to have to be looking for their activities and things that they do to draw your attention to whether or not you need to look into their activities further. So you guys will see within that reports to the nation that typically perpetrators of fraud are male. 69% of the perpetrators were male in 2018's report, and the remaining 31% were female. We're also going to see in that report age brackets, education levels, and things such as that. One thing you should notice within that report is that the older the perpetrator, the higher the loss. So keep your eyes open and pay attention to what's going on at an organization. When we look at fraud risk, we will consider what is referred to as the fraud triangle, which we will discuss much more throughout the class. Basically, the fraud triangle has 3 points. We've got the first one, perceived pressure, the second one, perceived opportunity, and the last one, rationalization. But how can you remember the points to the fraud triangle? Well, I typically have my students remember the word more, as in fraudsters typically perpetrate fraud because they want more money, for example. So M is actually what we're going to use for the bottom left. O for opportunity, R for rationalization. How can you remember M? Motivation or perceived pressure. What is motivating or pressuring them into perpetrating fraud? It could be personal debt. They could have mounting medical bills for themselves, for a family member. They could have credit card debt. They could have student loans or tuition. They could have some type of significant financial loss something that they've already experienced in a significant financial loss, or one that's looming or about to be experienced. They could even have ego-related issues. They could have peer pressure to succeed, or possibly family pressure to succeed. You could even have someone motivated to perpetrate a fraud due to a drug problem, or an alcohol problem, or a gambling problem. So keep in mind this leg of the fraud triangle when you're doing a risk assessment. Does the organization have anyone there who may have one of those types of motivating or pressure type of things going on? In regards to perceived opportunity to commit, is there a lack of supervision? Are there poor internal controls or no internal controls? Does the organization have very poor record keeping? Is there an extreme level of trust with an individual or with a group of individuals? And if so, there's opportunity there because they've been trusted with access, etc. Is there a lack of discipline in regards to previous frauds? Has there been no disciplinary action taken in the past when someone has done something they shouldn't do? Well, then they might be perceiving that as opportunity to commit if they're not going to be punished. In regards to R, or rationalization, many times it is heard after the fact, oh, I was only borrowing it, or I'll repay it later. Many times, perpetrators of fraud have said they've deserved what they took. They were overworked, underpaid, or have received some other type of poor treatment during their employment. Other perpetrators have said things like, it's not that much, they'll never miss it. And also, boss or so-and-so does it all the time. So they're rationalizing to themselves why their behavior is okay. Not only do we have the fraud risk assessment, but we also have use of the fraud diamond in addition to the fraud triangle. And if you'll notice, we're adding one more point, and it goes along with our MOR, but it's capability. Does an individual or group of individuals have the capability, in addition to these other points, to perpetrate a fraud? Do they have knowledge about the corporate governance system, the economic institutions in play? Do they have the ability to manipulate others with documents, with emails, with phone calls, with in-person conversations? Do they have the technical knowledge to steal information from the organization or money, possibly even identities of customers, of vendors, in order to pull off the fraud or exploit some type of weaknesses within the systems? Many times they circumvent the policies and the procedures, the standards and the protocols in order to pull off the fraud. Again, we've mentioned the fraud tree, and as we proceed throughout this course, we are going to go into these three distinct areas. We've got the corruption types of schemes, we've got asset misappropriation schemes, and then we have financial statement frauds. All of these are occupational or organizational types of fraud. Notice that the asset misappropriation has the biggest list linking up to it, and many times we have lots and lots of asset misappropriation schemes that can go on at an organization. So when we go about doing our fraud risk assessment, we are going to make sure that we identify fraud risk and schemes that are possible utilizing this tree. Again, we'll look at the likelihood, high, medium, or low, and the significance of a loss that could be experienced as high, medium, or low. We'll identify the personnel or departments involved in the areas or processes or the authorizations needed to perpetrate the type of fraud. We'll identify any existing fraud control activities that are going on. We'll evaluate those, their effectiveness, and we'll identify and evaluate any residual fraud risk. And then based on all that, we'll determine our response to the fraud risk, each individual one. And we will put into play those new things. In regards to what's going on currently and in the future, we have organizations including the AICPA and Rutgers University working on how to audit 100% of an organization's transactions. I may be posting an article about that at some point, but again, if you wanted to look it up, 100% audit and continuous monitoring, it's something of the future that we hopefully are going to be able to utilize to help us with fraud risk. So, in wrapping up our fraud risk assessment, we're going to identify those existing fraud control activities and assess their effectiveness, and then determine what else do we need to do to respond to those risks. And we're hopefully going to be using a lot of data analytics techniques. Utilization of data analytics is definitely being worked on and used more often than it has in the past. And I'm going to be sharing some additional articles with you all in future modules in regards to the analytics procedures that we need to be doing specifically related to fraud. We're going to perform periodic reassessments. Okay, this is not just a one-time deal. We are going to continually be doing it and assessing those changes that need to be made. And then we definitely need to also document our risk assessment, because when we do circle back later and reassess, we need to look back and see what we did the last time and possibly the time before, and consider that information as we move forward. As I mentioned, within the appendix of this guide, there are some matrices available within those appendix tools, so go and check them out. This fraud risk assessment is an iterative process. We're going to re-perform it periodically. And when we do it, we're going to consider the changes within the organization, the changes of the technology we use, the changes within the business environment as a whole. We're going to also consider regulatory or the economic environment. We're going to consider compliance activities that we are required to do based on the type of organization we are. And all of this warrants re-performance on a continuous basis. Again, it's the board of directors and management's responsibility to make this happen. With our data analytics, as we are all highly aware, in today's business world, data is everywhere. We know that it's a very involved process to capture it and then to make use of it and be able to understand all the complex data sets from multiple sources within a business. And this is very important, especially when addressing fraud risk management. In the ACFE's biannual report to the nations, the 2018 one, they reported a 58% reduction in the duration in time. And we know that if we have a shorter amount of time that a fraud goes on, then the loss is less because it's been shortened in time. So there is a reduction in time will equate to a reduction in losses. And data analytics is how we're going to continue to reduce that amount of time by making use of our tools and our knowledge about fraud. So organizations should devise data analytics strategies for their identified fraud risk. So basically what we could do within this fraud risk assessment is come up with our list of potential fraud risk and then figure out what data analytics do we need to run to detect fraud as fast as possible if it's been perpetrated. And then use our data and our technology that's available. So we're going to start with the business's objectives. We're going to figure out what their related fraud risks are. What are their relevant business processes? Assess their control weaknesses. Map to the source data. And then develop analytics procedures. And we want to address all aspects of the fraud triangle. Who could be motivated to perpetrate a fraud against the organization? Are there any red flags evident? And we're going to talk about red flags in much greater detail in a later module. We're going to think about who has the potential opportunity to perpetrate a fraud. And many times, it's the most trusted employee or employees. And we will consider how could they do it when we go about designing our data analytics. Techniques that we could include, we're going to examine trends of information, trends related to invoice numbers, dates of invoices, amounts of invoices, types of expense recognition, maybe types of revenues, types of journal entries, and the trends related to when those entries are made. Not only what date are they dated, but the time and date of when they're entered into the system and by whom. We're going to look for and find anomalies and perform recalculations. We're going to double check work. We're going to think about the relationships between ratios. If an organization has operated a certain way for a period of time, what would we have expected their results to be versus what are their reported results? Do they make sense or do they not make sense? We will look into techniques regarding data visualization. Sometimes when we're looking at all this data, we've got mounds and mounds of documents and lines and columns of numbers. But sometimes if we can find another way to view it, we might be able to find that needle in the haystack. We'll also discuss integrated reporting mechanisms. So when we talk about data analytics and summing up our information, it's all about the analytics design, mapping our needs to the potential schemes, and then collecting the data. And then we know the organization of it, the cleaning of the data can take the longest, and then the calculations, not much, because we're using computers to do a lot of this. And then analyzing the data, and then considering what output there is, what are our findings, what are our observations, and what remediation, if any, is necessary. We're going to be cautious regarding our data analysis and our findings. We need to be leery of false positives. And we also need to be cognizant of the possibility of false negatives. And of course, this analytics is a massive group effort. It involves the board of directors, management, internal audit, staff level employees, information technology folks, even our external auditors, consultants, and legal may all have to get involved in helping us to gather information that we need in order to do a good job. Something else that's also discussed within the Fraud Risk Management Guide is that maybe organizations need to not only develop a very robust fraud risk management program, but they may also need to actually designate a person and even a department to handle it. And we could actually have a Chief Fraud Risk Management Officer that works along with the CEO, the CFO, the CIO, and all those other C-suite folks in order to have oversight over the work. Emerging technology and concerns regarding data analytics and other things that organizations are using when it comes to fraud risk management. As I had mentioned earlier, that EY had a 2018 report, which is their Forensic Data Analytics Biennial Report, that management has so much more to be concerned with. The risks are increasing, but also at the same time, the technologies that are becoming available are helpful. With the risks that are increasing, that means more time and therefore money need to be available or to be spent on handling those risks. But of course, we're also looking at margins, so they're always trying to do less with more, or excuse me, more with less. So using these technologies to also help them, do a better job at fraud risk management comes into play. So some things that are out there on the forefront being used: social media analytics. This could be a possible gold mine for red flags of fraud. For example, many times perpetrators of fraud live beyond their means. So you could see via social media analytics, is someone living beyond their means? Take for example, Facebook. Where all is somebody traveling to? What kind of living arrangements do they have? What kind of car do they drive? What kind of clothing and jewelry are they wearing? We've seen the video in regards to Rita. Red flags of fraud were evident everywhere. In regards to social media analytics, you could also consider relationships that someone has or can have. Many times relationships lead to collusion. Text analysis is basically analysis of words used in emails, in text messages, in voicemails that have been converted to text. And organizations could use keyword searches. For example, was the word kickback used anywhere? Friend fee, risky, liability, critical, weak, unbalanced, delay. There are words that we could look at and the context in which they were used. And it's kind of like pulling on a piece of yarn and unraveling to see what you're able to find. And we'll talk more about text analysis in a later module. Fraud examiners and forensic accountants could use link analysis. Who is talking to whom, about what, and when. Data visualization comes into play. It can help us to identify patterns or anomalies in data. Again, vast data is available. Artificial intelligence, it's here. Technology that enables computers to perform decisions-based tasks that were previously done by humans. And analysis of it and decisions. Machine learning is here. Improvements in speed over time are possible with machine learning. Robotic process automation. This is the use of software with artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities to handle high volume, repeatable tasks that previously required humans to perform them. It's here. It's being utilized. Data protection is a big deal, as is data privacy compliance. And these two areas cannot be ignored by management, forensic accountants, or fraud examiners. With data protection, we're talking about the collection and dissemination of data. You hear about issues all of the time. How could it be used by a fraudster? What companies are, gathering and holding on to data? What could they do with it? What about data privacy compliance? There's an increasing number of regulations being put into play. GDPR, you guys can look it up, as of May the 25th, that was put into play. Even UTC needs to comply with GDPR because we may have students from the European Union here. And this is basically to protect unauthorized access or use of someone's personally identifiable information. So all of those things need to be considered when we are looking at fraud risk assessment.